The winter storms of Boston have a uniquely vicious way of howling through the city. They tear off the Atlantic Ocean, whipping freezing rain and sleet against the historic brick facades of Beacon Hill. But as I sat in the penthouse boardroom of the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, listening to the glass rattle under the storm's fury, I realized that the biting cold outside was absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating, freezing cruelty actively suffocating the air inside this room. I sat perfectly still at the head of the colossal, antique mahogany conference table. My late husband Richard and I had purchased this exact table 30 years ago at a local estate sale. Back then, this towering empire of luxury hospitality was nothing more than a single, desperately struggling bed and breakfast. We had spent our nights on our hands and knees, scrubbing floors until our knuckles bled, skipping meals to pay the heating bills, and sacrificing every ounce of our youth to build a legacy. Now, the heavy scent of lemon polish and wealth hung in the air, but the vultures had finally arrived. The very people I had bled to provide for were circling above my head, eagerly waiting to pick my old bones completely clean. My daughter-in-law, Isabella, stood looming over me. She did not look like a woman deeply concerned for her aging, widowed mother-in-law's fragile health. Dressed in a razor-sharp, blood-red designer suit that probably cost more than my first hotel's monthly mortgage, she looked exactly like an apex predator who had finally cornered her wounded, exhausted prey. Her stiletto heels clicked against the imported Italian marble floor, a sharp, rhythmic ticking that sounded like a countdown to my execution. Without a single word of comfort, she slammed a massive, heavy stack of legal documents directly onto the polished wood. The sharp, aggressive smack echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence of the boardroom. Printed across the top page in bold, unforgiving, and unapologetic black ink were the words, "Absolute Conservatorship, Asset Transfer, and Medical Power of Attorney." "It is over, Eleanor," Isabella said, her voice dripping with a sickening, highly rehearsed mixture of fake pity and raw, venomous arrogance. She leaned forward, placing both of her manicured hands flat on the table. The heavy, overpowering scent of her expensive French perfume washed over me, making my stomach physically churn with disgust. "The private doctors have made it perfectly clear. Your mind is rapidly deteriorating. You are slipping away from us." I looked up at her, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "You forgot my name twice last week," Isabella continued, her voice rising in theatrical volume for the benefit of the room. "You dropped your antique tea tray in the parlor, shattering family heirlooms because your hands wouldn't stop shaking. You wandered into the lobby yesterday looking for Richard, Eleanor. Richard has been dead for 30 years. You are practically a ghost wandering these halls, holding on to a crown you no longer have the mental capacity to wear." She paused, letting the brutal humiliation of her lies sink into the stagnant air. She was gaslighting me with the precision of a seasoned psychopath. The dropped tea tray, the momentary lapses in memory, they were carefully orchestrated moments of weakness I had intentionally spoon-fed to her. But she believed them entirely. "Sign the company over to Leo," Isabella commanded, pointing a long finger at the documents. "Let us put you in a comfortable, high-end psychiatric care facility in Vermont, where you can finally rest. You will be looked after, and the Caldwell legacy will be protected." Protect the legacy. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of that statement almost made me break character and laugh out loud. I slowly turned my heavy eyes to my biological son, Arthur Jr. He was sitting directly to Isabella's right, slouched in his custom-tailored, dark navy Italian suit. I had paid for that suit. I had paid for his Ivy League education. I had paid for the multi-million-dollar estate he currently lived in. Yet here he was, staring intensely at his expensive, polished Oxfords, his pale face slick with a cowardly, nervous sweat. He was 35 years old. He was a grown man, yet he couldn't even summon the basic human courage to lift his chin and meet his mother's eyes while his wife actively stripped away my freedom, my dignity, and my life's work. "Arthur?" I whispered. I deliberately let my voice crack, pitching it higher, making myself sound frail, confused, and utterly terrified. I let my lower lip tremble just a fraction of an inch. "Arthur, please, are you really going to sit there and let her do this to me? I am your mother. I built this for you. Arthur flinched violently, exactly as if I had reached across the wide table and struck him across the face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his tight collar, but he kept his eyes desperately glued to the floor. It's for your own good, Mother," he stammered, his voice weak, pathetic, and trembling. "You're sick. You're not yourself anymore. We just want to protect the family. Isabella is right. It's time for you to let go before you ruin everything." My heart, which had been beating with a slow, measured rhythm, suddenly turned into a block of absolute ice inside my chest. This was my flesh and blood. This was the boy I had cradled when his father passed away, the boy I had sworn to protect against the entire world. And he was selling me out for a life of lazy luxury, completely willing to lock his own mother in an asylum just to secure his unearned inheritance. Standing in the far, shadowed corner of the grand boardroom, leaning casually against the massive mahogany bookshelf, was Julian. He was my chief operating officer, a man I had personally promoted. He offered me a smug, deeply victorious smirk, subtly adjusting his expensive silk tie. I watched his eyes dart toward Isabella. It was a micro-expression, a fleeting glance of shared, intimate triumph. They thought they were brilliant. They thought they had perfectly executed the ultimate corporate and familial coup. Isabella shoved a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen across the table. The expensive metal rolled smoothly over the wood, clinking softly against the saucer of my bone china teacup. "Sign it, Eleanor," she demanded. The fake, sugary sweetness was entirely gone now. The mask had completely slipped, leaving only the cold, hard, merciless demand of a thief. "Don't make this any more pathetic than it already is. If you fight this, we will drag you into open court, declare you mentally incompetent in front of the entire Boston press, and take it anyway. Save yourself the final humiliation." I looked at the gold pen. I reached out with a deliberately, violently trembling hand. I let my fingers hover over the cold metal. I let my breathing become shallow and ragged. I gave them exactly what they wanted to see: a defeated, broken, senile old woman who had finally surrendered to the crushing weight of her own fading mind. But beneath my gray hair, beneath my pearls and my tailored Chanel suit, my mind was not shattered. It was terrifyingly sharp. A widow might be left alone in this cold world, but a woman who builds an empire from nothing never, ever forgets how to defend her crown. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply stopped my hand from trembling. The fake tremor vanished instantly, replaced by the absolute rock-solid stability of a seasoned corporate predator. I pulled my hand back from the pen, picked up my teacup with perfect, elegant grace, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my Earl Grey tea. The sudden, jarring shift in my demeanor sent a microscopic ripple of confusion across Isabella's arrogant face. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy, soundproof double doors of the boardroom violently swung open. My personal attorney, Victor Lang, a ruthless legal shark known for completely dismantling corporate giants, strode into the room. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 towering, stone-faced federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the golden letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. Victor didn't offer a single polite greeting. He completely ignored the gasps of shock from my cowardly son. He marched straight past Isabella, reached into his sleek leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, certified, tamper-proof medical envelope. With a flick of his wrist, he slammed the DNA test results directly on top of Isabella's conservatorship papers. Before I tell you exactly what scientific biological impossibility was printed inside that envelope, and how I systematically, mercilessly burned their stolen, deceptive world straight to the ground, let me take you back to exactly 3 days ago. To the precise moment a simple teacup shattered on the floor, and I realized I was sleeping in a den of vipers. 3 days ago, the sky over Boston was an unforgiving, bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a freezing downpour. The atmospheric pressure dropping outside my Beacon Hill estate perfectly mirrored the suffocating heaviness settling inside my own chest. I was sitting in the private glass conservatory of my home, surrounded by my late husband's prized collection of rare orchids. The air was warm and artificially humid, but I felt completely frozen to the bone. I had just been discharged from Massachusetts General Hospital the previous afternoon following a minor transient ischemic attack. a mini stroke, as the doctors called it. It was a fleeting glitch in my blood pressure, a brief moment of dizziness that lasted less than 2 minutes. The top neurologists had assured me that my brain scans were completely flawless. My cognitive faculties were as sharp as the razor edge of a diamond. But as I sat in my plush armchair, pouring a cup of Earl Grey from an antique Royal Doulton silver tea service, I realized that my family did not see a temporary physical weakness. They saw a monumental opportunity. Arthur Jr., Isabella, and Julian, my supposedly loyal chief operating officer, had insisted on checking in on me. They sat on the velvet sofa opposite my chair. I looked at my son, Arthur. He was swirling a glass of expensive aged bourbon at 10 in the morning. When Richard died 30 years ago, Arthur was only 5. In my desperate grief, I had overcompensated. I wanted to shield him from the brutal, exhausting struggle of building the Caldwell Empire. I gave him the softest beds, the finest tutors, and an endless safety net of immense wealth. I thought I was protecting him, but looking at his soft, uncalloused hands and his weak, evasive eyes, I realized the horrifying truth. My endless coddling had not forged a king. It had merely bred a parasite. And then there was Isabella. When Arthur first brought her home 15 years ago, she was a fiercely ambitious girl from a lower middle-class suburb, desperate to escape her mundane life. I welcomed her. I paid for her elocution lessons, introduced her to high society, and essentially bought her a place among the Boston elite. I gave her the world, and in return, she had slowly, methodically wrapped her manicured fingers around my son's throat, turning him into a compliant, silent puppet. I picked up my bone china teacup. As I lifted it to my lips, a sudden, horrifying thought crossed my mind. If they truly believe I am vulnerable, how far will they go? I decided to test the waters. I deliberately let my wrist go limp. The delicate porcelain slipped from my fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. The hot, dark tea splattered across the pristine white rug. I gasped softly, putting a trembling hand to my mouth, playing the part of a startled, fragile old woman. Oh dear, my hands, I don't know what happened. I waited for the natural human reaction. I waited for my son to rush forward, to ask if I was burned, to gently help his mother clean up the mess. Nobody moved. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the conservatory. Arthur simply stared at the broken porcelain, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Julian leaned back against the sofa cushions, an unreadable, calculating smirk playing on his lips. It was Isabella who finally broke the silence. She let out a long, highly exaggerated sigh of profound exhaustion, rolling her eyes as if dealing with a stubborn, unruly toddler. "Again, Eleanor?" Isabella said, her voice dripping with artificial patience. She didn't call me mother. She hadn't for months. "This is the 3rd time this week you've broken something. You're becoming a hazard to yourself." "The 3rd time?" I whispered, allowing genuine confusion to mask my calculating mind. "Isabella, I haven't broken anything else." "Mother, please," Arthur chimed in, his voice whiny and deeply patronizing. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "Don't do this. Don't make us pretend. You threw a glass at the maid 2 days ago. You were screaming that she was trying to poison your food. You don't remember?" My breath caught in my throat. The sheer, audacious cruelty of the lie was breathtaking. 2 days ago, I had been reading quietly in my library. I had never raised my voice at my staff in 30 years. He was actively rewriting my reality to my face. This was textbook gaslighting, a meticulous, coordinated effort to make me question my own sanity. "Arthur, I did no such thing," I stuttered, forcing my hands to shake visibly in my lap. "I would never—" "It's the cognitive decline, Eleanor," Isabella interrupted smoothly, crossing her elegant legs. She spoke about me as if I wasn't even in the room, as if I were a defective piece of furniture. Dr. Evans warned us about these aggressive dementia outbursts. It's the brain damage from the stroke. You are hallucinating. You are forgetting things. Just yesterday, Julian had to stop you from authorizing a catastrophic double payment to the European contractors. You were completely disoriented. I shifted my gaze to Julian. Julian, the man I had mentored, the man whose career I had built from the ground up. "It's true, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice a low, soothing baritone that masked a lethal poison. He opened his leather folio and pulled out a stack of documents. I caught the error just in time. The shareholders would have crucified us. Because of your delicate state, I've had the IT department temporarily suspend your biometric access to the executive financial servers and the shadow ledgers. It's strictly a precautionary measure to protect the company's assets from your memory lapses. The spring inside my chest compressed so tightly I thought my ribs would snap. They were locking me out of my own company. Julian wasn't protecting the assets. He was building a digital fortress to hide something massive. And they were using my brief hospitalization as the perfect, unquestionable excuse to do it. They were systematically stripping me of my authority, my dignity, and my grip on reality. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Julian by his expensive silk tie and throw him through the glass walls of the conservatory. The ruthless businesswoman who had ruthlessly crushed rival hotel chains in the 90s screamed at me to tear them to pieces right then and there. But I am a creature of strategy. If I reacted with anger, I would give them exactly what they needed. I would prove Isabella's lie about my aggressive dementia outbursts. I would hand them the legal ammunition to lock me in a psychiatric ward before the sun went down. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire 65 years on this earth. I swallowed my pride, buried my absolute fury deep within my soul, and played the victim. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing into the armchair. I stared at the broken porcelain on the floor, allowing a single genuine tear of profound betrayal to slip down my wrinkled cheek. I didn't know, I whispered, my voice a hollow, defeated rasp. I didn't realize I was getting this bad. The servers. Yes, Julian. You should handle the ledgers, keep the company safe. Isabella smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. The old queen was finally broken. Don't worry your fragile little head about the business anymore, Eleanor, Isabella cooed, standing up and walking over to me. She didn't help me pick up the broken cup. Instead, she placed a cold, manicured hand on my shoulder, her fingers digging slightly into my collarbone, a subtle, physical assertion of dominance. Arthur and I will take over the legal burden. We have already contacted the lawyers to draft a conservatorship agreement. We will transfer the executive voting rights to Leo, and we will manage the estate for him until he comes of age. You just need to sit here, rest, and fade quietly into the background where you belong. Fade quietly into the background. I kept my head bowed, staring at the tea soaking into the rug. My silence was not surrender. It was the quiet, deadly stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I was memorizing their arrogance. I was logging every insult, every lie, and every patronizing smirk into a mental vault. I am so tired, I mumbled weakly. Please, I just want to be left alone. Of course, Mother, Arthur said quickly, already standing up, eager to escape the uncomfortable presence of the woman he was actively destroying. We'll let you rest. They turned to leave, entirely convinced of their absolute victory. But just as Julian reached for the brass handle of the conservatory doors, the sharp, frantic ringing of my private emergency landline shattered the oppressive silence of the room. It was a dedicated line. Very few people had that number. I reached over with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy receiver. Hello? Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell? A woman's voice asked. Her tone was strictly professional, but carried an undeniable weight of extreme urgency. This is the Emergency Trauma Center at Boston Medical. I am calling regarding your grandson, Leo Caldwell. He has been in a severe high-speed automobile accident on the interstate. He is currently in critical condition, and we need his immediate family here right now. I slowly lowered the phone. The fabricated drama of my failing mind instantly evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard shock of a genuine tragedy. I looked up at Isabella and Arthur, the mask of the senile old woman slipping for just a fraction of a second. It's the hospital, I said, my voice suddenly devoid of any tremor. Leo has crashed his car. He is dying. The game of corporate thrones was abruptly put on hold. But neither they nor I had any idea that the impending medical emergency at the hospital wouldn't just save Leo's life. It was about to expose a 19-year-old biological secret so devastating it would blow their entire criminal conspiracy wide open. The drive to Boston Medical Center was a terrifying, chaotic blur of flashing sirens, blaring horns, and reckless swerves through the freezing winter rain. I sat rigidly in the back of my chauffeured Maybach, my hands gripping the leather armrest until my knuckles turned completely white. Despite the vicious corporate war raging within my family, Leo was still my grandson. He was a reckless, entitled 18-year-old boy with far too much money and far too little sense, but I had loved him since the day he was born. When we finally burst through the sliding glass doors of the emergency trauma ward, the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights immediately stung my tired eyes. The overwhelming, sickening smell of cheap industrial bleach and stale waiting room coffee hung heavily in the chilly air. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the long, sterile corridor. Isabella was pacing back and forth, her expensive designer stilettos clicking a sharp, rhythmic, and highly irritated tempo against the cheap linoleum floor. She was furiously typing on her smartphone, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. She did not look like a devastated mother, terrified for her only child's life. She looked significantly more inconvenienced than heartbroken. Arthur sat slumped in an uncomfortable, molded plastic chair, his head buried deep in his trembling hands. His tailored Italian suit was severely wrinkled, and his broad shoulders shook slightly under the bright hospital lights. A few feet away, leaning casually against a vending machine with a cup of black coffee, was Julian. He had practically invited himself, claiming the company needed to offer absolute support to the executive family during this crisis. Before I could approach them, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open. A visibly exhausted attending trauma surgeon stepped out into the quiet waiting area. He wore blue surgical scrubs that were stained with dark, terrifying spots of fresh blood. He pulled his surgical mask down around his neck, revealing a deeply lined, physically drained face. "Family of Leo Caldwell?" he called out, his authoritative voice echoing down the sterile corridor. We rushed forward, forming a tight, anxious circle around the medical professional. "He is medically stable for the moment," the surgeon said, holding up a thick metal clipboard and clicking his pen. We managed to successfully stop the primary hemorrhaging in his upper left thigh, and his vital signs are currently holding steady on the monitors. However, the internal trauma from the steering wheel impact caused his overall hemoglobin levels to drop to a critically low point. We need to administer a massive blood transfusion immediately to prevent him from slipping into severe hypovolemic shock. Arthur let out a loud, shuddering breath of profound relief, leaning heavily against the painted drywall for physical support. "Then do it immediately," Isabella demanded, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the tired doctor. "Give him the required blood, patch him up quickly, and get him into a private VIP recovery suite. We don't have all day to stand in this depressing hallway." The doctor frowned deeply, clearly unimpressed by Isabella's highly demanding, arrogant attitude. "It is not that simple, ma'am," he said, his professional tone growing noticeably firm and uncompromising. "Your son has a very rare and specific blood type. He is AB negative positive. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be a massive logistical issue, but our hospital's blood bank experienced an unprecedented shortage this week due to a multi-car pileup on the interstate. We simply do not have enough AB positive or universal O negative blood in our immediate inventory to safely complete the required transfusion." He looked directly at Arthur, then shifted his serious gaze to Isabella. "We need direct family donors right now. The boy desperately needs blood, and he needs it flowing into his veins within the next hour to survive. We can bring you both into the lab and cross-match you immediately." The world around me seemed to halt completely. The low mechanical hum of the hospital ventilation system faded entirely away. The distant, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors went dead in my ringing ears. The attending doctor's specific words echoed loudly in my mind, repeating over and over again, like a broken, skipping record. A B positive. The boy is a B positive. AB. My mind, rigorously trained over decades to analyze complex financial data and detect absolute factual inconsistencies, immediately latched onto a monumental, undeniable biological impossibility. I am an O blood type. My beloved late husband, Richard, was an O blood type. By the absolute, unbreakable scientific laws of human genetics, two biological parents with type O blood can only ever produce children with type O blood. Therefore, my biological son, Arthur, was undeniably, factually, an O blood type. I knew this for an absolute fact. I vividly remembered the medical paperwork from his severe childhood appendectomy. Isabella, I knew from a brief conversation years ago regarding a luxury holistic diet plan she was following, was an A blood type. I stood perfectly still in the sterile hospital corridor, staring blankly at the white wall directly behind the doctor. Basic high school biology began to scream, blaring massive alarms deep inside my head. An O blood type parent and an A blood type parent can naturally produce an A blood type child. They can occasionally produce an O blood type child, but they cannot, under any conceivable scientific circumstance, ever produce an AB positive child. The dominant B allele had to come from somewhere. It had to come directly from a biological father who actively carried the B genetic trait. Arthur absolutely did not carry it. I absolutely did not carry it. Richard absolutely did not carry it. There was only one impossible, horrifying, devastating conclusion staring me right in the face in that bright hallway. The teenage boy bleeding out on the surgical operating table, the boy I had spoiled, loved, and prepared to inherit my massive luxury hotel empire, did not have a single solitary drop of Caldwell blood running through his veins. Leo was not my biological grandson. I slowly turned my heavy head to look at Isabella. She was frantically arguing with the tired doctor, loudly demanding he call another private hospital to fly the necessary blood in by an emergency helicopter. She was putting on a loud, incredibly aggressive performance to deliberately distract from the obvious urgent request for her to donate her own blood. She knew she couldn't donate. She knew the cross-match would expose her. Then I turned my cold gaze directly to my son. I fully expected to see a man confused by basic genetics. I fully expected to see a worried, grieving father questioning the doctor about a potential catastrophic laboratory error. Instead, what I saw chilled me to the absolute bone and shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Arthur was backed firmly against the painted hospital wall, gripping the metal handrail with bone-white knuckles. He was not looking at the frustrated doctor. He was not looking at his screaming wife. He was staring firmly and intensely at the linoleum floor, his entire body trembling violently. He was sweating profusely. He was not confused by the science. He was utterly terrified. He knew, he absolutely, undeniably knew the genetic math did not add up. When he finally found the courage to lift his heavy head, he felt my intense eyes burning right into him. For one brief, absolutely terrifying second, our eyes met across the sterile corridor. He saw the cold, sharp realization settling permanently over my face. He saw that I had done the genetic math in my head. Arthur immediately broke eye contact, looking away entirely, completely unable to face the mother he was actively helping to destroy. Julian stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Isabella's back, and offered to use his corporate connections to secure a private helicopter transport for the blood from a neighboring state. I waited until Julian had stepped away to make the calls. I waited until the doctor retreated to the trauma bay. The suffocating tension in the hallway was palpable. I looked at my son, and with a voice that was incredibly calm, measured, and entirely free of accusation, I set the trap. "Arthur," I said softly, stepping closer to him, "I am a little confused by the medical details. The doctor was very clear that Leo is an AB positive blood type, but Richard and I were both O blood types. You are an O. Isabella is an A. How exactly does a boy with those biological parents end up with AB positive blood?" Arthur flinched physically, exactly as if I had stabbed him in the ribs. The nervous sweat on his forehead instantly returned in heavy beads. He did not give me a puzzled look. He did not express genuine confusion. Instead, he reacted with immediate, explosive, and deeply defensive hostility. "Are you out of your mind?" he snapped, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He stepped toward me, his voice cracking with high-pitched, desperate anger. "My son is lying in a hospital bed, bleeding to death, and you are trying to turn a simple, stupid clerical mistake into one of your paranoid, senile delusions?" "Arthur, I am simply asking a logical—" "There is no logic in your rotting brain anymore," Isabella hissed, stepping right into my personal space. She glared down at me, her eyes filled with absolute malice. "This is exactly what Dr. Evans warned us about. Your mind is completely broken, Eleanor. You are making up insane, psychotic conspiracy theories because your brain is misfiring. You are a sick, demented old woman." Arthur pointed a shaking finger right at my face. "Do not do this today, Mother. Do not start your crazy interrogations. The laboratory made a typo on his chart. It happens all the time. But you wouldn't understand that because you can barely remember your own name. You are an absolute embarrassment." The sheer venomous audacity of their gaslighting hit me like a physical blow. They were weaponizing my supposed dementia to cover up a 19-year-old biological fraud. They were screaming in my face, calling me insane, trying to bully and humiliate me into doubting my own flawless intellect. In the ruthless world of corporate acquisitions, I had sat across the table from hundreds of desperate men trying to hide terrible truths. I knew exactly what a cornered, guilty coward looked like when the walls of his deception began to close in. Arthur was an incredibly poor liar. If he truly believed it was a simple laboratory typo, he would have brushed off my questions with a tired sigh. But he attacked me. He viciously used my recent health scare to deflect a completely logical question. The anger inside me was a towering inferno, burning so hot it turned completely cold. But I could not let the spring uncoil. Not yet. I looked at the furious, sweating faces of my son and my daughter-in-law. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my hands begin to tremble violently. I widened my eyes, filling them with fake, pathetic tears of confusion and fear. I'm sorry," I whimpered, taking a shaky step back. I pressed a hand to my forehead, acting entirely overwhelmed and disoriented. "You're right. My mind, it's just so confusing. I don't know what I thought. Please forgive me, Arthur. I am just a confused old woman." Isabella let out a harsh, mocking scoff, crossing her arms over her chest. "Exactly. Now go sit down in the corner and stay out of the way before you give yourself another stroke. We will be finalizing the conservatorship papers tomorrow morning. It is completely obvious you cannot be trusted to make rational decisions anymore." I nodded weakly, shuffling away from them like a defeated, broken ghost. I walked to a dark corner of the waiting room and sat down in a plastic chair, burying my face in my trembling hands. They looked at me and saw absolute victory. They saw a woman entirely crushed by her own failing mind. But behind my trembling hands, my eyes were dry, clear, and utterly lethal. They had just given me the final piece of the puzzle. I didn't just suspect them anymore. I knew. And while they spent the night worrying about their stolen son, I was going to spend the night gathering the physical evidence required to execute them. I remained huddled in the uncomfortable plastic chair in the dimmest corner of the waiting room, my face still buried in my hands. Through the narrow gaps between my fingers, I watched them. The performance of my supposed cognitive collapse had worked flawlessly. The suffocating tension that had gripped Arthur and Isabella just moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced by the intoxicating, poisonous relief of criminals who firmly believed they had literally gotten away with murder. Isabella leaned against the pale hospital wall, letting out a long, theatrical exhale. She ran a manicured hand through her perfectly styled hair, shooting a highly significant, victorious look toward Julian, who had just returned from making his phone calls. I watched Julian's eyes trace the curve of Isabella's neck, a lingering, deeply intimate gaze that had absolutely no business existing between a chief operating officer and his boss's wife. In that single, unguarded micro-expression, The sickening 19-year-old truth was physically confirmed before my very eyes. Arthur, entirely oblivious to the silent, romantic communication passing right above his head, stood up and wiped the cold sweat from his brow. He looked at his wife, his posture relaxing into a pathetic slump of surrender. He had survived the genetic scare. He thought his mother was too far gone to piece the puzzle together. Isabella walked over to the corner where I was sitting. She didn't kneel to meet my eye level. She stood towering over me, casting a long, oppressive shadow across my trembling frame. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with a sickening, honey-coated condescension usually reserved for a deeply confused toddler. She reached out and patted the top of my head. The physical contact was repulsive, her cold fingers pressing against my gray hair in a profound display of absolute disrespect. "The helicopter is on its way. Leo is going to be perfectly fine, but this environment is far too stressful for your fragile condition. You look completely drained. You are going home now." I slowly lowered my hands, looking up at her with wide, vacant eyes. "But Leo, I should stay for Leo." "No, Mother," Arthur interjected, stepping up beside his wife, emboldened by my apparent submission. "You are just getting in the way here. The doctors need space, and frankly, we don't have the energy to manage your delusions while dealing with a real medical crisis. The chauffeur is waiting at the front entrance. Go home, take your sedatives, sleep." Isabella leaned in closer, the overpowering scent of her French perfume practically suffocating me. "And Eleanor, do not forget, the board members and the legal team will be at the penthouse tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp to finalize the conservatorship. Have your maid dress you in something presentable. We wouldn't want the board to see how truly pathetic you've become before you sign the papers." The absolute audacity of her gaslighting, the vicious, calculated humiliation delivered right in the middle of a hospital ward, was a masterclass in psychological torture. They were stripping away my humanity layer by layer, confident that I was too weak, too old, and too mentally shattered to ever strike back. The spring inside my chest compressed to its absolute maximum limit. I did not glare at her. I did not bare my teeth. "Yes, Isabella," I whispered, my voice a hollow, defeated rasp. "Tomorrow at 10, I will be ready." I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on my silver-handled walking cane, and shuffled toward the exit. I allowed my shoulders to slump, playing the tragic role of the deposed queen walking toward her own exile. I could feel their arrogant, mocking eyes burning into my back as I walked away, but I did not turn around. The moment the heavy glass doors of the hospital slid shut behind me, the cold, biting Boston wind hit my face, and the fragile, trembling old woman completely ceased to exist. I straightened my spine, my posture instantly snapping into rigid, unyielding steel. The fake tremor in my hands vanished, replaced by the lethal, rock-solid stability of a seasoned corporate predator. I slid into the back of my Maybach, the heavy door thudding shut, sealing me in absolute privacy. "Take me to the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, Marcus," I instructed my chauffeur, my voice entirely devoid of the pathetic weakness I had weaponized upstairs. "Use the private underground executive entrance." I didn't have time to mourn the illusion of my family. I had exactly 24 hours until they attempted to legally bury me alive, and I needed the biological ammunition to execute them first. The hotel was quiet when I slipped through the private access elevator. I bypassed the grand lobby and headed straight for the top floors. My first target was the Executive Fitness Center. Julian was a creature of immense vanity and absolute routine. He kept a private, permanently reserved locker in the VIP changing room, frequently leaving his workout gear for the hotel laundry staff to manage. I used my master key card, the physical one that Julian's digital lockout could not override, to access the locker room. It smelled of eucalyptus and expensive cologne. I opened locker 01. Sitting right on top of his gym bag was a damp silk workout towel he had used that very morning before rushing to my house to stage his intervention. I pulled a sterile plastic evidence bag from my designer purse, carefully dropping the towel inside, sealing the biological material tight. Half the battle was won. Now, I needed the final nail in the coffin. I took the elevator up to the residential penthouse suites. Leo, the boy I had mistakenly believed to be my grandson, occupied the largest suite on the east wing. I let myself into his room. It was a chaotic mess of expensive video game consoles, designer sneakers, and scattered clothes, a monument to the spoiled, entitled life I had entirely funded. I walked directly into his lavish marble bathroom. Resting in a silver tray on the vanity was his personalized, monogrammed silver hairbrush. I pulled out a pair of tweezers and held the brush up to the harsh vanity lights. Woven deep into the bristles were 3 distinct strands of dark hair, the tiny, whitish root follicles still perfectly intact. It was a goldmine of undeniable genetic material. I plucked them out, dropped them into a second sterile bag, and slipped both pieces of evidence into the inner pocket of my Chanel suit. I left the hotel as silently as a ghost, my heartbeat a steady, rhythmic drum of impending vengeance. When I finally returned to my Beacon Hill estate, the house was dark and agonizingly silent. But I did not go to my bedroom to take the sedatives Arthur had so cruelly suggested. I walked straight into my grand oak-paneled library. I locked the heavy double doors from the inside and pulled the thick velvet curtains shut. I approached the massive antique oil painting of Richard that hung above the fireplace. I pressed a hidden latch on the ornate wooden frame. The painting swung open smoothly, revealing a biometric wall safe. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A soft green light blinked, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Julian thought he had successfully blinded me by locking me out of the digital network. He vastly underestimated the paranoia and preparation of a woman who built her fortune in the gritty, ruthless hospitality wars of the 1980s. Inside the safe sat a thick, leather-bound book, the Shadow Ledger. It was a completely offline, manually updated physical record of every single massive financial transaction moving through Caldwell Heritage, maintained weekly by a fiercely loyal, heavily compensated private accountant who answered only to me. I carried the heavy ledger to my desk, turned on the brass reading lamp, and opened a secure burner phone I kept locked in the bottom drawer. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. "Victor," I said, the moment my attorney answered the line. My voice was sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Cancel everything you have for the next 24 hours. I need you at my estate immediately. Bring the Premier Genetic Testing Lab's emergency contact and call Robert Sanchez. I need the best private investigator in Boston running a deep dive background trace on Isabella and Julian dating back exactly 20 years. There was a brief pause on the line. Victor Lang was a shark, and he instantly smelled blood in the water. "Who are the targets, Eleanor?" "My son, my daughter-in-law, and my COO," I replied, staring at the cold, hard numbers in the ledger, already spotting the horrific, glaring inconsistencies hidden beneath Julian's fake shell companies. "They are attempting a hostile takeover tomorrow morning at 10, disguised as a medical conservatorship. And Victor, they think I'm senile. They think I'm completely broken." Victor chuckled, a low, dry, terrifying sound. "Then we will let them walk right into the slaughterhouse, Eleanor." For the next 12 hours, my library transformed into a heavily encrypted war room. Victor expedited the genetic samples through a private, highly confidential laboratory utilizing a premium emergency fee. Sanchez, the private investigator, began systematically tearing apart the digital and financial histories of Isabella and Julian. By dawn, the psychological torture for my family resumed. My smartphone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Isabella. "The board is arriving in 3 hours. Make sure you take your medication, Eleanor. Do not embarrass Arthur today by having one of your episodes. Be compliant, sign the papers, and this will all be over smoothly." I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer, intoxicating arrogance of her words was astounding. She truly believed she was speaking to a defeated, helpless prisoner. She was gaslighting a woman who was currently holding the match that would burn her entire existence to the ground. I picked up the phone. I deliberately made my voice sound incredibly weak, raspy, and thoroughly exhausted as I left her a voicemail. I understand, Isabella," I whispered into the receiver, letting out a pathetic, shaky sigh. "I took my pills. I'm so tired. I won't fight you anymore. I just want this to be over." I hung up the phone and smiled. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, a chilling, predatory baring of teeth in the quiet, shadowed library. The spring was fully compressed, the trap was set, and my arrogant enemies were blindly marching their king directly onto my killing floor. The day of absolute reckoning arrived with the cold, sterile light of a Boston winter morning. At exactly 9:55 a.m., I stood outside the massive mahogany double doors of the Caldwell Heritage Penthouse boardroom. For the past 3 days, I had played the role of a fading, broken ghost. I had allowed them to humiliate me, gaslight me, and systematically strip away my dignity. The spring inside my chest had been compressed until it physically burned. Now, it was time to let it snap. I pushed the heavy doors open and shuffled into the room. The space was packed. Isabella had orchestrated a grand, highly theatrical audience for her ultimate moment of triumph. She sat squarely at the very head of the long, polished conference table, occupying the exact leather chair that had belonged to my late husband, Richard, and then to me. To her right sat Arthur, looking incredibly pale and sweating through his custom navy suit. To her left sat Julian, his posture radiating absolute unchecked arrogance. The rest of the table was lined with the executive board members. Mostly sycophantic lackeys Julian had recently promoted to serve as compliant rubber stamps for their hostile takeover. They looked at me with a mixture of forced pity and smug dismissal. They fully believed they were about to witness the pathetic, final surrender of a senile old queen. I walked slowly, leaning heavily on my silver-handled cane, and took the single empty chair at the far opposite end of the massive table. The room fell completely silent, save for the faint howling of the winter wind against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Isabella leaned forward, interlacing her manicured fingers. She was practically vibrating with greedy, unadulterated triumph. She motioned to one of Julian's lackeys, who quickly slid a thick, heavy manila folder down the length of the table. It came to a gentle stop directly in front of me. Sitting right on top of the legal paperwork was the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. "This is the final medical conservatorship and asset transfer agreement," Isabella stated, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom. The fake, sugary sympathy was entirely gone. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and dripping with venom. "The transition of executive power has already been approved by the board members present. We have streamlined the legal process. All we need right now, Eleanor, is your final signature on the bottom line." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Buried deep within those pages was an indemnification clause that would legally frame me for the $4.5 million they had embezzled from the employee pension fund. They intended to use my dementia to bury their massive criminal enterprise entirely under my name. Isabella leaned back in my chair, a cruel, mocking smile spreading slowly across her perfectly made-up face. "You are completely done here, Eleanor. Your mind is broken. Sign the papers, let Arthur and me protect the legacy, and quietly accept your retirement in the Vermont facility. Do not make this a public embarrassment." The sheer, brutal audacity of her words hung heavily in the stagnant air. Julian chuckled softly, adjusting his silk tie. Arthur kept his eyes glued to the table, too cowardly to even watch his mother's execution. I did not react. I kept my face an impenetrable mask of frail confusion. I slowly reached out with a violently trembling hand and picked up the heavy gold pen. I held it loosely, letting the bright morning light catch the golden barrel. I looked directly at Arthur. I gave him one final silent plea, one fleeting opportunity to be a man, to stop this madness before the federal hammer came crashing down. Arthur swallowed hard, saw the question in my eyes, and actively chose his path. He completely broke eye contact, staring blindly at his shoes. The betrayal was final. I slowly opened my fingers. The gold pen dropped from my hand, hitting the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clack. I did not pick it up. I simply stopped shaking. The violent tremor in my hands vanished instantly. I straightened my spine, abandoning the hunched posture of the defeated widow. I placed both of my hands flat and perfectly steady on the polished wood. I looked down the length of the table, my eyes locking onto Isabella with the lethal, unblinking focus of an apex predator. You told me my mind was rapidly deteriorating, Isabella, I said. My voice was no longer a weak, raspy whisper. It was a booming, resonant command that cracked through the room like a whip. You said I was hallucinating. You said I dropped that antique teacup because my brain was severely damaged. Isabella's cruel smirk faltered. A microscopic flicker of confusion crossed her face as the frail old woman before her suddenly transformed into a titan of industry. I did not drop that teacup because of a stroke, I continued, my words measured and terrifyingly cold. I dropped it to see if any of you possessed a single shred of human decency. You failed. And as for my memory, it is absolutely flawless. In fact, it is sharp enough to remember the fundamental laws of high school biology. Before Isabella could even open her mouth to respond, the heavy double doors of the boardroom violently swung wide open. Victor Lang strode inside, flanked by two towering, stern-faced federal agents in dark FBI windbreakers. The room's temperature instantly plummeted to an absolute freezing cold. The arrogant, triumphant smiles plastered across the faces of the executive board members vanished, replaced by a thick, suffocating wave of collective terror. Victor marched directly toward the head of the table, stopping just a few feet away from where Isabella sat frozen in my leather chair. He unclasped his sleek black briefcase, the sharp metallic snap slicing through the absolute silence. He reached inside and pulled out the thick tamper-proof envelope containing the verified genetic laboratory report. With a smooth, practiced flick of his wrist, he tossed the crucial document onto the exact center of the table. It slid smoothly, coming to a sudden halt directly between Isabella and Arthur. "I am legally representing Eleanor Caldwell," Victor announced loudly, staring coldly down at Isabella. "The sealed document I have just placed before you is a legally binding, independently verified genetic analysis. The biological samples analyzed yield a probability of paternity of exactly 0%. The subject, currently known as Leo Caldwell, is definitively and permanently excluded as the biological offspring of Arthur Caldwell Jr. The heavy words hit the stagnant air like a physical shockwave. A profound, horrified gasp echoed from the board members. Isabella's arrogant, beautifully constructed smirk violently shattered into a hideous mask of pure, undeniable panic. All the blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent white. The confident predator who had just seconds ago ordered me into an asylum was instantly replaced by a cornered, hyperventilating animal. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as they hovered uselessly over the stark white envelope. Julian suddenly felt the crushing, suffocating weight of his reality. His smug grin was completely wiped from his sweating face. Recognizing the federal agents, his deep financial knowledge told him exactly what was happening. He placed his sweating hands on the table and desperately attempted to push his heavy chair backward, instinctively trying to flee. He barely made it halfway to his feet before one of the towering federal agents moved with absolutely terrifying speed. The agent slammed a massive, incredibly heavy hand firmly down onto Julian's shoulder, forcing the corrupt COO aggressively and painfully back into his seat. "Do not attempt to stand up, sir," the agent commanded sternly, his voice a dangerous threat. I stood up from my chair at the far end of the table. The entire room watched me as I walked slowly, purposefully, down the length of the room. I stopped directly behind Arthur's chair. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out the printed email Sanchez had recovered from the deleted archives, an email date stamped exactly 10 years ago. I threw the crisp paper directly onto Arthur's lap. "Do not dare play the victim today, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly, gravelly whisper. "You knew you were sterile from the mumps you had as a child. You have known for 10 long years. You actively conspired with your wife to raise another man's son because you were absolutely terrified that the Caldwell bloodline clause would strip you of your unearned luxury." Arthur looked down at his own email address printed on the page. His knees gave out beneath the table. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep, ugly, visceral, pathetic sobs. "Mother, please," he choked out. "She made me do it. I was terrified you would cut me off." "And you, Julian," I said, turning my gaze to the man pinned to his chair. I pulled the printout of the shadow ledger from my purse and tossed it onto the table. You told me yesterday that you were temporarily suspending my access to protect the company's assets from my memory lapses. It seems I remembered exactly where you hid the $4.5 million you systematically drained from the employee pension fund using those 4 fake LLCs in Delaware. Your access, Julian, is permanently suspended. The unholy alliance they had so carefully constructed over 15 years rapidly crumbled into a venomous, screaming match. Arthur was sobbing uncontrollably. Isabella hysterically pointed her finger at Julian, screaming that he was the mastermind. Julian snarled back, cursing her greed. They were cornered rats, viciously tearing each other to absolute pieces. I watched their total destruction with absolute, unblinking detachment. My heart was a frozen, impenetrable vault. They vastly underestimated the profound, dangerous resilience of a woman who had actually scrubbed floors and bled to build the ground they were currently standing on. I gave Victor a single nod. The federal agent stepped forward, their heavy steel handcuffs gleaming brightly in the morning light.
"Isabella Caldwell, Julian Vance," the lead agent announced, his commanding voice silencing the chaos. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the criminal embezzlement of $4.5 million. You have the right to remain silent." The harsh, metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around Isabella's wrists echoed with sharp, absolute finality. She did not surrender quietly. She began to thrash violently, her tailored red suit twisting as she kicked her expensive stilettos wildly against the marble floor. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing. "I gave you the illusion of a perfect family. My mind isn't broken, yours is. You owe me, Eleanor." "Take her away," I said coldly, quoting her own vicious gaslighting right back to her face. "She is clearly hallucinating. She is becoming a hazard to herself." The agents dragged the screaming Isabella and the utterly defeated Julian out of the double doors. The heavy mahogany slammed shut, cutting off her fading shrieks. The treacherous board members scrambled out the side doors in absolute terror. I turned my attention to my weeping son. Victor handed me a single sheet of legal paper. I dropped the legally binding eviction and disinheritance notice directly onto Arthur's lap. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear your belongings out of the Beacon Hill estate," I stated, my tone as unforgiving as solid granite. "You are stripped of your corporate title, your salary, and you are permanently disinherited. You sold my legacy for a paycheck. Get out of my building, Arthur, and never ever call me mother again." 6 months have gracefully passed since that brutal winter storm tore through the penthouse boardroom of Caldwell Heritage. Today, the biting Boston chill has completely surrendered to the gentle, blooming warmth of spring. I am sitting in the private glass conservatory of my Beacon Hill estate, surrounded by Richard's vibrant, thriving orchids. The sunlight streams through the glass, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. I lift my bone china teacup and take a slow, peaceful sip of Earl Grey. It is the exact same teacup I intentionally shattered on the marble floor half a year ago. I hired a master artisan to repair it using the ancient Japanese art of kintsugi, mending the broken porcelain with seams of pure, liquid gold. It sits in my hands now, heavier, far more beautiful, and infinitely stronger because it was broken. It is the perfect metaphor for my life. The relentless, grinding wheels of federal justice moved with an agonizingly slow, but ultimately devastating certainty. I sat quietly in the heavy oak pews of the federal courthouse, watching the final chapter of Isabella and Julian's monumental arrogance come to a decisive and permanent end. The presiding judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate predators, delivered a blistering reprimand that echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. Isabella and Julian were both sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and grand embezzlement. Isabella did not scream or thrash this time. She stood completely frozen, her once flawless designer wardrobe replaced by the stark, humiliating reality of a standard-issue prison uniform. The luxurious, pampered life she had spent nearly 2 decades lying and manipulating to secure had violently evaporated into thin air. They were marched out of the courtroom in heavy iron chains, permanently exiled from the opulent world they had tried to steal from me. My son, Arthur, faced a very different, yet equally crushing kind of prison. Completely cut off from the vast Caldwell wealth and abruptly stripped of the lavish lifestyle he had grown so incredibly accustomed to, he experienced a brutal, unforgiving crash into reality. I hired a private investigator to check on him exactly once, simply to ensure the eviction had been fully executed. Arthur is currently living in a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the less desirable outskirts of the city. He spends his days working as a valet at a rival boutique hotel, parking the expensive luxury cars he used to drive, and enduring the freezing rain for meager tips. He had finally been forced to learn the true value of a hard-earned dollar, a lesson Richard and I had desperately tried to teach him decades ago. I feel absolutely no pity for his current miserable circumstances. He is simply reaping the barren harvest of the deceitful seeds he willingly sowed. As for Leo, the 18-year-old boy who grew up believing he was the sole heir to my empire, I did not leave him entirely destitute on the streets. He was a product of monumental deception, but he was also an unwitting victim of his mother's profound sins. I legally severed all familial ties, but I provided him with exactly 1 year of fully paid college tuition and basic living expenses. That gave him 12 months to find a part-time job, secure student loans, and figure out his own path forward. After that, he is completely on his own. While the architects of my attempted destruction faced their grim new realities, I focused all of my formidable energy on repairing the profound damage they had inflicted upon my life's work. The recovery of Caldwell heritage was not a simple task, but I approached it with the same relentless, driving determination that had allowed me to build the empire from a single, struggling bed and breakfast. My very first executive action was to personally contact the fiercely loyal senior executives and staff members who had been unceremoniously fired during Isabella and Julian's brief, arrogant reign of terror. I invited them back to the corporate headquarters, offering them their former positions, along with substantial financial bonuses and sincere, heartfelt apologies. Together, we worked tirelessly alongside the federal investigative team to trace every single stolen penny through the complex labyrinth of offshore routing protocols. The $4.5 million was successfully recovered in its entirety, and I personally oversaw the direct transfer of those funds back into the employee pension accounts. But the ultimate restoration of my company required a profound structural change to the very foundation of the Caldwell legacy. I needed to ensure that monumental greed could never again threaten the empire I sacrificed everything to create. I executed a brand new, unbreakable trust agreement. 50% of my entire personal wealth and corporate holdings were instantly transferred into the newly established Richard and Eleanor Caldwell Foundation, a massive philanthropic initiative explicitly designed to provide unrestricted grants to single mothers and brilliant underprivileged women starting their own businesses. The remaining 50% of the company was irrevocably placed into an employee stock ownership program. The immense wealth of Caldwell heritage will not be handed down to an entitled, ungrateful heir. It is now systematically distributed among the dedicated housekeepers, the exhausted concierges, and the loyal executives who actually bled to build this place alongside me. This evening, I stand alone on the expansive rooftop balcony of the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, looking out over the endless, glittering Boston skyline. The cold wind whips at my Chanel suit, but I feel a deep, radiating warmth blooming steadily within my chest. I reach into my pocket and pull out a heavy, tarnished brass key, the original key to the very first room Richard and I ever rented out 30 years ago. I am a widow, I am solitary, but looking out at the magnificent empire I protected, I have never felt more incredibly free. They say that blood is thicker than water, but life has a funny way of teaching you the hardest truths. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, honesty, and respect are what truly make you family. I spent years pouring my heart, my soul, and my wealth into people who only saw me as an obstacle to their own greed. But the moment I stopped being the victim they wanted, I became the queen they feared. What about you? What would you do if the people you trusted the most, the people you shared your home and your heart with, turned against you in your darkest hour?
Have you ever had to draw a hard line and cut a toxic family member out of your life to protect your own peace and sanity? Let me know your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you found satisfaction in this story of absolute justice and old money revenge, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone steal your crown.
Câu chuyện để lại trong tôi bài học sâu sắc về bản chất của tình thân. Giá trị đích thực của gia đình không nằm ở sợi dây huyết thống, mà được thử thách qua lòng trung thành và đạo đức. Khi lòng tham và sự ích kỷ chiếm trọn tâm trí, ngay cả những người ruột thịt thân cận nhất cũng có thể tàn nhẫn quay lưng, sẵn sàng chà đạp lên tình nghĩa để mưu cầu lợi ích cá nhân. Bên cạnh đó, câu chuyện là lời cảnh tỉnh đanh thép. Đừng bao giờ coi thường sự nhẫn nhịn hay đánh giá thấp bản lĩnh của người đi trước. Sự im lặng hay nhún nhường của họ không phải là yếu đuối, mà là biểu hiện của sự bao dung và cái nhìn đại cục. Một khi ranh giới tôn nghiêm bị vượt qua, danh dự và những giá trị thiêng liêng bị xâm phạm, sự kiên cường cùng trí tuệ tích lũy qua năm tháng của họ sẽ thức tỉnh. Đó là đòn đáp trả mạnh mẽ và quyết đoán nhất, khiến mọi âm mưu phản bội, dối trá đều phải trả giá đắt trước công lý và lương tâm.